Good morning. Once again, I want to welcome all of you to our worship this morning. It's good to see each and every one of you and those that are visiting. We're certainly glad that you have come our way to be with us today. A couple of other announcements that came into my mind after I sat down a moment ago. John Mark has an aunt that's been having some health issues, and she's been in the hospital. I understand she's in rehab now. Is that in Kaufman? I need to get information on that, so if you want to check in with him. And also, Joanne's daughter, Leanne, had surgery on her foot this past week, and is she still doing well? Is she recuperating? Sort of. She is home, though, isn't she? Yeah, okay. So she's recovering at home as well. So sorry for the oversight on those early this morning, but be mindful of those in your prayers also. If you would open your Bibles to Luke chapter 15. Luke chapter 15. Last couple of weeks in our class, we've been talking a little bit about our prison ministry work and what's been going on with that, and we had a little extra information this morning from some of the lessons that we actually teach at the prison with the inmates there. One of the Bible stories that we use extensively, and one of the lessons, one of the parables that Jesus gave in his teaching, which serves as a basic outline for a lot of what we talk about down there, is the parable of the Prodigal Son. A parable that's very familiar to most all of us. I'm sure we've read it many times. We've probably studied it many times. But it may be one that because we have become so familiar with it, we have forgotten some of the better lessons, the more important lessons from that. And so I want to read Luke chapter 15, beginning verse 11, down through the end of the chapter. And we'll study the prodigal son this morning. We'll talk about the son, the prodigal son. We'll talk about the older son. And we'll also talk about their father. And really, I think the father should be probably the most, where the most emphasis should be placed in this particular story. We probably won't do him as much justice as we should in the time that we have available. So follow along with me. Luke chapter 15, beginning of verse 11. He said, a certain man had two sons. The younger of them said to his father, Father, give me the portion of thy substance that falls to me. And he divided unto them his living. And not many days after, the younger son gathered all together, and he took his journey into a far country. And there he wasted his substance with riotous living. And when he had spent all, there arose a mighty famine in that country, and he began to be in want. And he went and he joined himself to one of the citizens of that country, and he sent him into the fields to feed swine. And he who would have fain have filled his belly with the husk that the swine did eat, and no man gave unto him. And when he came to himself, he said, How many hired servants of my father's have bread enough and to spare, and I perish here with hunger? I will arise and go to my father, and I will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and in thy sight. I am no more worthy to be called your son. Make me as one of your hired servants. And he arose and he came to his father. But while he was yet afar off, his father saw him, and was moved with compassion, and he ran and he fell upon his neck, and he kissed him. And the son said unto him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and thy sight. I am no more worthy to be called thy son. But the father said to his servants, Bring forth quickly the best robe, and put it on him. Put a ring on his hand, put shoes on his feet. Bring the fatted calf, and kill it. Let us eat and make merry. For this my son was dead, and is alive again. He was lost, and is found. And they began to make merry. Now his elder son was in the field, and as he came and drew nigh to the house, he heard the music and the dancing. And he called to him one of his servants, and inquired what these things might be. And he said unto him, Thy brother is come, and thy father has killed the fatted calf, because he has received him safe and sound. But he was angry, and would not go in. And his father came out and entreated him. But he answered, and he said unto his father, Lo, these many years do I serve thee. I never transgressed a commandment of thine, and yet thou never gavest me a kid, that I might make merry with my friends. But when this, thy son, who has devoured thy living with harlots, thou killest for him the fatted calf. And he said unto him, Son, thou art ever with me, and all that is mine is thine. But it was meet for me to make merry, and to be glad. For this your brother was dead and is alive again. He was lost and has been found. To properly understand this parable as Jesus gave it, we need to, before we actually get into the parable itself, go back and look at the first part of the chapter. In the first part of the chapter, the first 2 verses of Luke chapter 15, we find this: that all the publicans and the sinners were drawing near unto him to hear him. Both the Pharisees and the scribes murmured, saying, This man receives sinners and eats with them. It's in light of that context that Jesus gives these 3 stories: the parable of the lost sheep, the parable of the lost coin, and the parable of the lost son. The Pharisees and the scribes were those who were always antagonistic against Jesus, but they were the ones that thought themselves to be better than everybody else. They were the righteous ones of the community. And they looked down their nose at everybody else. They despised everybody else as being disobedient and unworthy of God's love and mercy. And yet Jesus is there, and the tax collectors and the other sinners around them, whatever they might have been, they were coming to Jesus. And they were listening to Jesus. And Jesus was welcoming them unto him, and he was even eating with them as if to have fellowship with them. And this did not sit well with the Pharisees and the scribes at all. And so they began to murmur and they began to complain about what Jesus was doing. The story that we read, the prodigal son, the lost son, tells about two boys and their father. One who went away and wasted his inheritance in riotous living, we're told. He represents the tax collectors and the sinners that were coming to Jesus. The older son, who claims that he had never dishonored his father, he'd never disobeyed his father, but he was always there. He was the self-righteous one. He was the one that always did what his father said. And therefore he was very antagonistic. He was hateful toward this younger brother of his. And so as Jesus is telling this story, it seems that he is really talking about those 2 groups and the relationship they had one with the other, and how evil the Pharisees and the scribes were, and how evilly they treated those that came to Jesus, and how much they despised those who came to Jesus. This story that we have here before us this morning from the Master Teacher is one it's used to help understand the nature of many of our sin problems and our addiction problems that we might have in life. And you might be sitting here thinking, well, I don't have an addiction problem. Well, maybe you don't. Or maybe you do and you just don't realize it. They can come in all different forms and shapes and sizes and so forth, and sometimes we have them and we're not even aware of it. In fact, I had one man in my class ask me this last few months, could a guy be addicted to the Dallas Cowboys? And I said, well, certainly he could. Or the Texas Rangers, or sports in general, or anything like that. So yes, addictions can oftentimes seem very, very benign, harmless to us, and so we overlook them. But they're still there at the same time. I want us this morning to make a study of the prodigal son and his brother and even the father as well, and in light of this context to see how it applies to those who are addicted to some substance or behavior pattern and seeking to recover from it. And our objective in this study is to help us all to see the need to move from a self-indulgent, self-centered lifestyle to one that is more in line with God, one that is more in tune with doing his will and not our own. As we do that, let us notice several things in this parable. Number one, we see the rebellious sons, or the prodigal son's rebellion, verses 11 through 13. We find that the younger of the 2 boys came to his father and said, let me have your inheritance. Let me have my inheritance, the part of the inheritance that belongs unto me. Normally this is done, of course, at the father's passing, at his death. There were times in the Old Testament history where we might have seen, others do that as well, but generally it takes place at death. But this young son, he wanted his ahead of that. His father did not try to talk him out of it, it seems, but he was willing to go through the process of liquidating much of his assets, maybe taking inventory of what he had, because the older son was entitled to two-thirds of the inheritance, and the younger son was entitled to 1/3. And so the father had to do some bookkeeping and accounting, and he had to liquidate some assets in order to make that all work out right. And so he gave the younger son his inheritance. And in the back of his mind, he's probably thinking, this isn't going to work out well for this boy. He may be going to go off over here, and he may be going to invest in some property, and he may be going to start a life on his own. The boy didn't say what he was going to do initially. And so the father may not have had any idea why he was wanting his inheritance. But it didn't make any difference. It was his son. He loved him. He was entitled to it. If he wants it now, then he's going to let him have it. So what does the son do? Well, the son takes his inheritance and he goes off to a far country. He crosses the border. A young man with a pocket full of money is always, is very, very likely to do something like that. He's going to head south. He's going to get into trouble. And maybe the father realizes this is what's going to happen. In the back of his mind, he's saying, this ain't going to work out too good for this boy. But he's got to learn lessons on his own. And so we see he wasted his inheritance, all of his possessions, all of his money, however much it was, in riotous, loose living. Foolishness. We might ask the question, why did he do this? What prompted him to do this? Well, the same thing that prompts us to do the things that we do that aren't in accordance with God's will. And that's self. Selfishness. We might call it selfish pride. We might call it ego. We might call it the big I problem. But whatever it is, it's all about me. And so this boy decided that he wanted to go and to explore the world because that's what he wanted to do. Now, he might have had some other friends that had done that. He might have had some other influences in other ways. But the bottom line is that it was self-centered. It was self-motivated. It was on self-seeking, his own selfishness, or whatever you want to call it. It's the same thing that caused Eve to obey the serpent in the Garden of Eden. One of those things that was there was the pride of life. The pride of life. And when pride gets into our lives like that, then what that does, that displaces God and causes us to play God ourselves. Because when I disobey God and when we disobey God, what that means is that I think I know better about what I can do than God does. That I don't think God's will really matters. I don't think what God's instructions are really make any difference. So God doesn't know what he's talking about, therefore I'm going to do what I want to do. And that was the attitude that this boy had. He didn't care about his father. He didn't care about his brother. He didn't care about anything around the farm. All he was concerned about was me. And so that's why he did what he did. Secondly, we see the results of that rebellion. Look at verses 14 through 16. We see where this rebellion got him. When he had spent all that he had, there arose a mighty famine in that country, and he began to be in want. And he went and he joined himself to one of the citizens of that country, and he sent him out into the fields to feed the swine. And when he would have desired or fain have filled his belly with the husk of the pods that the swine did eat, and no man gave unto him. He lost all of his money, and then we lost all of his money. About the same time that happened, this great famine came. The famine meant that the economy dropped. It went south. There were no jobs available. There was nothing for him to do except this one thing. He joined himself. McGarvey and Pendleton said in their commentary that he actually glued himself to this guy, as if he begged and begged and begged and pleaded for this job. And what was the job? Going out in the fields to feed swine. Now, in my class, I generally ask at this point, how many of you ever slopped any hogs? Well, I have. I've slopped hogs. I've raised hogs. I slopped them before I had any of my own to raise and whatnot. And we know that's not a real pleasant job. Some of the guys in my classes, at times, what does that mean? What do you mean by slopping hogs? They don't know what a slop bucket is. But anyway, they're not from the country. We're from the country. We know what a slop bucket is. So, but to the Jew, it's even worse than that. Because you recall that in the Old Testament, swine were unclean animals, as many others were. And when a Jewish boy gets to the point where he can't do anything but slop hogs, he's what we call at the bottom of the barrel. He has hit rock bottom. That's where he is. And so that's the result of this boy's rebellion. He ends up at the hog farm, and the hogs are unclean to the Jews, and he's out there desiring to eat the pods that were given unto the swine. Now, no doubt he got paid something. He may have just got room and board, but apparently it wasn't enough for him to really thrive on because he was starving to death out there in the process. The pods, I did some research on this not too long ago because I was wondering what that was. carob beans, much like our locust beans today. They were used for animal feed. They were very low and cheap means of food for humans as well when it was necessary. Carob is quite popular today because people make some kind of imitation chocolate out of it, and it's pretty popular. You can get that kind of stuff in the store now. But these carob beans is what they were feeding the pigs. And this boy would have desired to eat those. And I don't know if he did or why he didn't or whatever, but anyway, I'm not real clear on all of that. But he was feeding the swine, and instead of, he would have liked to have joined in with them and eaten with them. But he was starving to death out there. He was at the bottom of the barrel. He was at rock bottom, and he had no place else to go but up from there. And so we see the results of that rebellion. And sometimes we find ourselves making bad decisions, making poor decisions, acting selfishly, and we end up in a similar situation. We may not realize that we're being selfish until all of a sudden the spouse says, "I've had enough of you. I'm leaving." Or the kids rebel against us because we're mistreating them, because we're neglecting them, because we're abusing them. Or the boss fires us because we're spending too much time on our own thing and not on what he wants us to do. Or many other situations can come along that way. But we can find ourselves where our life becomes unbearable, unmanageable. And we don't even realize it until we hit rock bottom. And that's where this boy was. Next, we see the prodigal's realization of what he's done. Look at verse 17. Verse 17 says, "But when he came to himself," that is, he came to his senses, he got out of this mindset of selfishness. He was no longer thinking about himself. When he realized what was going on, he came to himself and he said, "You know what? How many hired servants of my father's had bread enough and to spare, and I'm perishing here with hunger?" He got to thinking in that hog pen. And sometimes we have to get to the rock bottom before we really start thinking rightly. The insanity finally leaves us, because when we're off doing our own thing, we're actually acting insanely. And he says, "You know what? I'm thinking now about where I came from, my father's house, and what I had there. I'm thinking now about where I've come to, where I am here in the hog pen, and I'm about to starve to death. And I also think about where I could be if I made a different choice." And so the boy, I don't know how long he was in that hog pen, but he could have stayed there and stayed there. He could have chosen to stay there until he died. Or he could take action and do something different. And he got to thinking about how it would be at home. He said, "I could go back home. I could go back home and just hire out to my dad. I could hire out to my father as a servant and be better off than I am here. I don't have to live under a bridge. I don't have to live without any clothes. I don't have to be starving to death all the time. I could do something differently. And I could be a whole lot better off." And so we see his realization of his actions. This is what, in the 12-step program, is what we would call step one. He is admitting now to himself that he is powerless over his situation, over where he is, and his life has become totally unmanageable. He can't fix it on his own. And so he says, I'm going to have some help. I've got to do this. I've got to get out of this situation. And so we need to be, when we look at ourselves, we need to be specific as well. We might say, well, he's powerless over sin. Well, that's true, because sin is the root cause of all of this. But what sin is it? What is the manifestation of that sin? Is it alcohol? Is it some type of illegal drugs? Is it some sort of illicit sexual involvement? Is it some type of gambling? You might be surprised the number of gamblers that you might know that you don't even know it, that they are gamblers. Online gambling has skyrocketed in the last decade since it became available online. And it's tremendous. And there are many, many people that are addicted to that kind of thing. Some are addicted to food. or have food type addictions. They either want to eat too much or they don't want to eat at all. There's sexual addictions, there's the gambling, there's overspending, there's workaholism, and yes, there's hunting and fishing and the cowboys. And anything else you want to add to that. There are many different forms of addictions that people have. And they may not even realize that they're addictions. And at some point we've got to be brought to our senses to realize that what we're doing is not what really is pleasing God. So the prodigal son, he made a resolve to change. Look at verses 18 and 19. He made a resolve. He says, I will arise and go to my father, and I will say unto him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and thy sight. I'm no more worthy to be called your son. Make me as one of your hired servants. So here's his confession, or his process of making that confession. He's resolving in himself to make a change. And so he says, he's determined now to turn his life and his will over, not to himself, but to his Father. And that Father, of course, represents God in this story. He's determined to turn his life and his will over to God and to let God now rule his life instead of himself ruling his life. When we take control of our lives, we are the only ones that's in control of our lives. And where does that get us? Generally gets us in trouble. It may not get us in jail or prison, but it gets in trouble some other way. And so we have this young man who's decided now that he's going to turn his life and will over to God. He's going to say, not my will, but thine be done, as Jesus said in the garden. He realizes the true nature, that his true nature is to be like his Father. His true nature is to be like his Father, not what he's been being for the last however long it's been. And anything else besides being like God is considered insanity. Now, we may think about insanity as being someone who needs to go to Terrell or Rusk or someplace like that because they got some kind of brain operation mix-up. But we're talking about life insanity here. We're talking about insanity that has to do with the way we make decisions, the way we live. And it becomes insane when we make these constantly negative, bad, harmful decisions. So the boy's in the hog pen. He's thinking about things. In verse 20, the first part of verse 20, he makes this statement. It says this, he arose and he came to his father. Now he thought about it. He discussed it in his own mind. He made a resolve of what he's going to do and what he's going to say. But until he actually took action, nothing is going to happen. But now he gets up and he goes back home. And that walk home was probably a whole lot longer and a whole lot more difficult than that walk out there when he left home. He's probably lost about 50 or 75 pounds. He's probably nearly naked. His clothes are all tattered and torn and smell like pigs. He's probably got a beard that looked like Elijah's. He's probably a mess. But he's making a determination to go back home. He's had his moral inventory. He's had his searching and fearless inventory. He's looked at himself long enough to say, I've hurt my father and I've hurt everybody around me, and now I want to go and make it right. And so he begins that long walk home. And there's more time for reflection as he's doing that. He's examining himself all along the way. Not only is he examining those that he hurt, but he's also thinking about those he himself resented. That was the word I was looking for earlier in class, resentment. He's taking not only an inventory of those that he's harmed and hurt by what he's done, but he's also looking at himself and seeing who he has resented. It might have been his father. It might have been his older brother. It might have been some other individuals around him. And that might have been part of the reason why he acted so selfishly and left. So he begins to walk home. Come back to verse 20. We begin to see the father's reaction. Verse 20. While he was yet afar off, his father saw him and was moved with compassion. And he ran and he fell upon his neck and he kissed him. Notice the father's initial reaction. That he saw him from a long way off while he was still afar off. And look at how he received him. He ran to him, which was, this has gotten a lot of interest in recent years, I think, but it's interesting to think that a middle-aged man in that day and time wouldn't necessarily go running to somebody like that. That was out of the character. He would have to swallow a lot of his own pride to do that. He would have to gird up the loins. He'd have to pull up that robe and tuck it under his belt. Or he might just take the robe off and run in his tunic. I don't know how he did it, but he ran to his son. And he recognized him while he was yet a long way off. And I find that interesting. I think what that means is that every morning about sunrise or every evening about sunset, before the day gets started good or as the day is winding down good, he's standing at the door of his house or his tent and he's looking down that road just in hopes that son will come back. He loved him enough to let him go, but he still loves him, hoping he'll return. And while he was yet a long way off, we're told, when it might have been very, very difficult to recognize him, he saw him coming. He saw the way he was walking. He saw something about him that he knew that was his son. Now, some fathers would say, okay, here he comes. He's got his tail between his legs. I'm going to make him walk all the way up to the house. He's going to crawl up on this porch, and he's going to beg and plead, and he's going to grovel at my feet before I do anything. Is that what this father did? No. While he was still a far way off, this father commenced to run to meet him. He loved him so much that he was so glad to see him, he ran after him. James says, if you draw near unto God, he will draw near unto you. The boy was still afar off from God. He was still afar off from his father. But his father was going to go meet him anyway. And that shows us something about the love that God has for us. We may not be as close to God as we should be. We may not be as close to God as we want to be. We may still be afar off. But as long as we're moving toward God, he's moving toward us. We see the restoration. The son, as he's being greeted by his father hugs him, he falls on his neck, he begins to kiss him, and his son begins his speech, so to speak, his confession. The son said unto him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and your sight. I'm no more worthy to be called your son. So he makes his confession. Confession is necessary whenever we have sinned against God or sinned against someone else. It's part of the healing process when we make those confessions. Proverbs chapter 28:13 says, He that covers his transgressions will not prosper, but whoever confesses them and forsakes them will then find mercy. This boy had confessed his sins to God. He confessed his sins to himself. He's forsaken that. Now he's going back to his father, and he's going to confess that to him. And he's going to find mercy. And he doesn't even get all of his confession out. He's about halfway through that speech. Because he doesn't even get to the part about, I'm not worthy to be called your son, just make me a hired servant. The father seems to interrupt and said, look, he said to his servants, verse 22, bring forth quickly the best robe, which no doubt was his robe, one of his robes. Bring and put it on him, put a ring on his hand, which was a sign of, I think, acceptance back into the family, and put shoes on his feet, which was a sign of comfort and hospitality, because only the slaves went barefooted. Again, a sign of it being back in the family. And then bring the fatted calf and kill it, and let us eat and make merry, for this my son was dead and is alive, is lost and was found. And so the restoration, the robe, the ring and the sandals, the fatted calf. We're told in that day and time that the families, no matter what they might have been, they kept a calf in the lot, and they kept it fatted for just some occasion when there needed to be some celebration, some party or something. And here's a time for that. And so he was restored back to the family. The father doesn't call him sorry, no good for nothing, thief, whatever. He says, this my son, who was dead, is alive again. He was lost and he's found. And so he restores him back into the family, back into fellowship, and we're going to rejoice. They have a rejoicing of that at the end of verse 24. So there's the father's reaction, at least to the son's coming home. Now as the story continues, and we'll have to move very quickly through this, look at the older brother's reaction in verses 25 through 30. The older son was in the field, working, no doubt, and as he came in the field, he drew near to the house, and he heard the music, and he noticed the dancing, and he called to one of the servants to him, and he said, "What's going on?" He said, "Your brother's come. Your father's killed the fatted calf," because he's received him safe and sound. And notice verse 28. The older son was angry. He was angry. Angry that his brother had come back home, and angry that his father's throwing this big party for him. And not only was he angry, but he refused to join in the party. He wasn't going to go in. He was going to stay outside. His father had to go outside and beg him, entreat him, plead with him to come in and rejoice with everybody else. And notice what he says about that. His self-righteous attitude in verse 29. He says, his answer was this: "These many years do I serve thee, and I've never transgressed a commandment of thine." Now, I asked myself this question: really? You think however old he is, he's never disobeyed his father anywhere? I doubt it. We know better. But that's his attitude. That's the way he thinks. He's never transgressed a commandment of thine. And yet you never gave me a kid that I might make merry with my friends. Maybe you never asked for one. Kid, that is a goat. You never gave me just a goat, a kid goat, much less the fatted calf. He's never been blessed by his father as the firstborn, as the oldest son, and all the rights and privileges that came along with that. Again, I think he's in denial. He's forgotten many things that maybe he had received, and he's not willing to admit that at this point. But when your son, he says in verse 30, your son, he's disowned his brother. It's not his brother anymore. That's your son. Your son who devoured your living with the harlots comes back home. You kill for him the fatted calf. And so you see his attitude, you see the arrogance, and you see the self-righteousness and the self-pity that he has because, I never had even a kid goat and a party for my friends. All these kinds of things are bound up in that older brother's attitude. And I wonder how those of us that have been brought up in the church, in God's house, always been a part of the family of God. And when we see other people come from the outside, and as James describes the poor man who's dirty and his clothes are tattered and he doesn't smell good, and when he comes into your assembly, where does he sit? He has to sit in the corner in the back somewhere. He's not offered one of the chief seats in the meeting house. How is it that we look at other people? And so Jesus, in this story, he reminds us of that. And we see the rejection of the younger brother, the rejection of the older brother toward his younger brother. But look at verses 31 and 32. As we bring this down to a close, look at the father's love for both of them. The father loves both of them, and he shows that here. He said to him, "Son, you are always with me, or you'll be with me forever. And all that I have is yours." He got his inheritance, yeah. But everything else that I've got belongs to you. You can kill a calf if you want to. You can kill a goat if you want. You can do whatever you want to. But, he says, it was right to make merry and to be glad. This is your brother. He was dead. He's alive again. He's lost. He was lost. And now he's been found. And so we see God's heart, the Father's heart, go out to even the older son. He doesn't chastise him. He doesn't browbeat him, severely rebuke him. But he just kindly entreats him, look, this is the right thing to do. Because this is your brother we're talking about. This isn't just somebody else out there. This isn't just my son. It's your brother. He's family. He's part of our family. And so the father here shows his acceptance of both sons and lovingly tries to guide the older one to a different way of thinking, to a more open mindset, so that he might be willing to accept the tax collectors and the sinners. And that's what God calls for us to do. He calls us, if we're the older brother, to get rid of that self-righteous mindset and be willing to accept the tax collectors and the sinners. We see a beautiful picture of God's infinite love for sinful man. Those who are sinners due to their overt rebellion against God, as well as those who are sinners because they think they've got everything right. The older son didn't have the same heart that his father had. And we need to have the same heart that God has. And that's what he's called us to do. I don't know about you this morning. I don't know if you can identify in one side of that story or the other side. If you do, then maybe you have gone away from God and you need to come back. Maybe as the rebellious son, you need to repent of all the rebelliousness in your life and confess that and seek God's forgiveness. Maybe as one who's been the arrogant, self-righteous son, looking down your nose at other people, maybe we need to quietly confess that at least to God and ask for his forgiveness and a change of heart. I don't know what your need might be this morning. If you have a need, God is calling you. He's calling the prodigal, and he's calling the elder brother as well. And if you need to come to him, if you'll come, if you'll start, he'll run and meet you. And if you need to come, won't you come as we stand, as we sing.